And I'm leading off.
And we're recording. Yeah, sure, Andrew. Why not?
Okay. What is going on, everybody? It is Dos Zekis, the Kevoy Boys, and we have a special guest on our show today to talk Lacan, Seminar 1, 2, and possibly some Hegel. Dr. Todd McGowan himself, author of many books, such as Hegel. Was it Hegel and Contradiction?
I think it's called Emancipation After Hegel.
Emancipation After Hegel.
I
Enjoying.
say I'm at my sister's house, and this is total coincidence. Just happened to walk in the room, and these 4 books were staring me in the eye.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's about half your bibliography right there, I believe.
Yeah. The whole discography all right there. But yes, wonderful Lacanian Hegelian scholar in the US, author of many books, was more than willing to come on, so we are honored to have him on. We had met before in defensive theory, correct, Todd, over on
That's
Theory
right.
Please.
That's right, Andrew.
Yeah. Really great conversation, really great intro. And a lot of work has been done, at least on our end, our being Nick and I. And as far as my Lacanian stuff been, I just published my first Substack article and Medium article dealing with the distinction between Freud and Jung theoretically, and kind of mediating it with Lacan from Seminar 1. So definitely good accomplishment. And we had just finished Seminar 1 together. It was a beast. So
wow. Yeah, so you guys are working through every seminar together? That's cool.
Yes.
Yeah,
great.
We had never intended even to create a YouTube channel, but we wanted to do a reading group, just the 2 of us. And we said, why don't we just record this? I'll share my screen and we'll do not exactly line item by line item, but as close to it as we can get. And people seem to be enjoying it. It's not easy, but as Lacan says at the beginning of the seminar, the fun is over. So we've had a lot of fun though.
I just want to say before we get this conversation rolling, I really appreciated your joke over the symposium that nobody got.
Well, that was really I thank you for saying that, Andrew. That was I was a little bit flustered by that. I mean, I thought maybe it would be like people would think it wasn't a great joke, but at least they would, see that it was a joke. But someone even had to write in the chat, like, they put out the 2 kind of marks, like MARKS and then MARX. I'm like, yeah, that was the whole thing.
I think half the chat genuinely believed they had exhumed Hegel's corpse. I think
that was the problem. Right. Right. I should have just said, I'm going to start with a joke that I'll clarify. I think you're right.
It was too smooth. It was too smooth.
I thought it was hilarious. So, Andrew, you want to start us off? We were thinking that we would begin just by spitballing about Seminar 1.
Sure.
Our last session, as we're calling them, will be released tomorrow. So we just wrapped it up, and I think it'd be a good time to, recap, review some central concepts, and get your opinion on where you feel this seminar might stand in terms of the overall oeuvre.
Yeah.
Of Lacan.
Sounds good.
So, yeah, my kind of inquiry with Seminar 1 is that, we usually get the notion that's like, well, you have Lacan of the imaginary, and he's working in the symbolic, especially with his early essay from the Rome, Function and Field of Speech and Language.
Yeah.
However, it seems like there's more of the real present there in Seminar 1 than is allegedly believed. The real is there, but it's it's never really kind of explicitly announced. He mentions it, but he never really says exactly what it is. But it's it seems like towards the end, this whole notion of the death instinct, sadomasochism, and that he will repeat a lot, and then compulsion to repeat mainly, which when he elaborates on death instinct or death drive in Seminar 2, he locates it in the symbolic. But do you believe that, kind of retroactively looking at Seminar 11 back to 1, that there's kind of like this recap of Seminar 1 and more of like situating the real rather than trying to build up the symbolic, especially looking at Seminar 1, he's building up from the mirror stage using the optical schema. And
Right.
from what Derek Hook said, the importance of logical time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's something to what you're saying for sure, Andrew. And I think you can, like, clearly the importance that death drive will have toward the end of Seminar 1 and then a lot in Seminar 2 is suggestive of how he'll conceive the real later on. But I think it is like when he says real here, he means reality, right? Like that. I think like there's a little bit of I think a lot of people that are even close to me, and it's easy to do because it's not, he never says, okay, now I've switched my idea of what the real is. And I mean, it's like this break within this interruption of the symbolic. He doesn't do that, but if you read what he says in Seminar 3, which you're going to get to, like, it seems very clear to me that he means real as symbolic social reality. So while I think you're absolutely right that the sense of the real that he will develop later on, say Seminar 10, Seminar 11, that sense, if you can read it back into and in fact, I was just looking over my notes to Seminar 2 and Seminar 1, and I wrote a little note, and this is like from 20 years ago. And I said, I have a little thesis I'm playing around with that there's no development in Lacan's thought at all, that he just uses different terms to refer to the same things. And so when he's talking about this death, the symbolic as structured through the death drive, later he'll just call that the real, but it's basically the same thing. And so I think, I'm not sure if I still think that, but I do think you're exactly right to see that the structural similarity is the same, even if there's a terminological difference. So yeah, I think that you're exactly right to see that.
Yeah, and especially thinking about it, it makes sense with like when he mentions the lure, right? The lure is everything with the mirror stage, mirror phase, and there's this weird like implicit lure in logical time where it's like it is only through the failure of C in person B, thinking that they're not, this other color, that I have this like certainty of méconnaissance and this recognition of who I am as the real subject. But I think that's where lies like the implicit, like with the lure and the symbolic identification with the other. It's like it has to be at a perfect time. It can never be too early or too late. Otherwise,
and that's where the real intervenes. I think,
yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I also think, I was just thinking about what you said. It's interesting how he stresses again, and he always stresses this, but I think here more than anywhere else, it's important not to understand me, like don't understand too soon, right? Like that, and that connects to the logical time thing as well, right? Like you have to go through that méconnaissance, go through that misrecognition in order to get to the proper recognition. So I think that's, and that it's also tied to an idea that he'll ultimately totally drop, which is the movement from empty speech to full speech, right? Like first, without the initial empty speech, there is no movement into full speech. So it's the same thing. It's again this like this mistake, this error. Through the error, you get to the truth, right? And so like truth has the structure of a fiction. Like these ideas will stay with him, but they just find slightly different formulations later on. But I think you're right to pick up on that. Like I think that's really crucial, that idea of the misrecognition, the méconnaissance, like how that leads to the proper recognition.
Yeah, and is this misrecognition? Does he get this like from like messing around with like the Kojevian Hegelian dialectic of misrecognizing yourself as the or the master?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think it's in. I can't remember which. You'll remember better than me. One of the, he says, I think it's Seminar 2, he says, I take my bearings from the master-slave dialectic and reformulate it again and again, right? Like that. Yeah. So I think it's exactly right. He's and it's certainly a Kojevian, because master slave dominated Hegel idea, and later he'll think that he's breaking from that, but certainly first you have to have the misrecognition in order to get the proper recognition, and that comes from a certain kind of Kojevian understanding of Hegel. I mean, the other thing that's I'm curious what you think about this, but it seems to me like this is a difference, like, because he hasn't yet introduced objet, and so desire here really is desire for symbolic recognition, right? And so that's really in the Kojevian heritage. And also, I find this really interesting. It's also in the whole Pittsburgh Hegelian heritage as well. So even though they're all about critiquing Kojev, getting rid of this Kojevian, but in the end, their position is that of mutual recognition, which is Kojev's position. So, and I think it is Lacan's position here too. Like, there's a lot of faith in the symbolic order, right? Like there would be this imaginary fight to the death, but then he even says, like, he says, "Thank God we live in the symbolic universe." You know, thank God for the symbol. And I just don't think he would say that 10 years later, right? Like, he would say, "Well, okay, the symbol comes, but there's still this failure within the symbolic structure." And I think that's not as emphasized in these early seminars.
I think with one thing though, he does say, it's like, yeah, like, thank God for the symbolic, but it's like, even in this imaginary struggle, in where there's aggressivity, which differs us from aggression in animals, but that with the symbolic or the symbol, it allows for one to kind of, I guess, die twice, or even risk death, because the fact of the language games of the symbol, there's the notion of a risk. Right. That risk of mastery.
That's right. Like, he even says something like, there's like, that the subject doesn't really fear, instead it risks, right? Like that. And I think that's really, and then that leads later on into this notion of how, like, the symbol allows us to hide in a way that, I mean, he plays a lot on this animal subject contrast in these seminars, right? And so the notion that only the subject can lie by telling the truth, and that the animal can lie just by lying. I think that's pretty cool. But that's tied to this notion of the wager, right? Like and it's funny to me how much the wager plays, like, even though he'll again move away from this emphasis on symbolic as solving problems, like the seminar 16 is all about, and he repeats that even about Pascal's wager, and the way he formulates objet in that seminar through the notion of the wager, Pascal's wager. So I think that, it's even when he leaves something behind, he never really fully leaves it behind, right? He's like repurposing it in a new way. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
It's almost like psychoanalyzing him, because it's like, when he leaves behind a concept, there's always the trace of that in his dialogue.
That's right. I mean, it's interesting because maybe most people that are going to see this saw this thing that we alluded to, the joke that I told, that Slavo's thing, and he got a pretty serious critique for his position on, he was called transphobic, and I thought, well, his and one of the reasons for the accusation was he keeps talking about trans all the time, and his defense was, well, I repeat everything. And part of the way that I operate is to take a single example. And he said, this is what both Hegel and Lacan do, is I take a single example, and then I am constantly repurposing it, understanding it differently, and deploying it in a totally new way, even though it seems like I'm just repeating the same thing. So I think he is following Lacan in that. Like, I think Lacan, same thing, this notion of the wager here the wager is meant to affirm the priority of the symbolic. And then in seminar 16, the wager is meant to affirm the priority of the real. So it's an interesting way that the same idea can operate in two different ways.
So you're talking about Lacan never quite abandoning certain concepts as much as he might shift away from the terminology that he's associated with at various points in his career. And I know that, famously, he abandoned the distinction between full speech and empty speech, as you mentioned. But also, uh, would you say that he abandons entirely the concept of intersubjectivity as his career progresses, or does that have a new transfiguration at a later point in his seminars?
Yeah, Nick, I think you picked up too that when I said he doesn't really abandon things, you picked up too that he really does abandon, right? So he really abandons the empty speech, full speech distinction by, I think the last slight mention of it is Seminar 7. Seminar 7 is this interesting hapax, right? Like it's not part of the early, it's not part of the late, and it just kind of sticks out there. And so it has little elements of the early, and then it has little elements that'll point toward the future, but basically it's a hapax. So I think that's the last mention of it, then it's gone. Intersubjectivity is gone even earlier. I think intersubjectivity is gone by Seminar 3. I think it does make some appearance in Seminar 2, but I'm pretty sure, I just reread Seminar 3, and I'm pretty sure it does not appear. And in fact, what will start to appear is a pretty vociferous critique of the idea of intersubjectivity, which he associates with a lot of other psychoanalysts, like Melanie, everybody basically,
Yeah,
like all
Michael
these
Ballant.
object relations. Sorry, Andrew.
Oh, I was just gonna say like Michael Ballant, especially.
Ballant, right, exactly, right. So he'll often, the other thing he calls it is like two body psychology, right? Like this idea that for him, intersubjectivity is the failure to grasp the role that the third party plays in the determinative role that the third party or symbolic order or big other, not that those are all the same, plays in any interaction. So I think it is interesting that I think he hasn't yet, in that sense, he hasn't yet become himself, right? Like, I think when he's saying intersubjectivity, I think he's not yet fully Lacan. Like, it's just not a Lacanian idea at all. So it's funny because I hear a lot of people who are not sort of outside of our circle, but kind of peripheral to it. They'll often say Lacan's conception of intersubjectivity. I'll be like, wait a minute, he doesn't have one. Like, once you say that, you've already kind of you've exposed yourself as not, you don't belong. So
I think it is interesting to talk about intersubjectivity, and I just kind of want to like expand off of Nick's question, because there is, like, in Seminar 1, the use of Jean-Paul Sartre and the gaze and this intersubjectivity relationship to ground, it seems like, if I'm not mistaken, to ground the understanding of not only the gaze, but like the master-slave dialectic via like perversion. And so like he doesn't really have a theory of intersubjectivity, but it seems like he's like kind of alluding to something like that because of his early influence into phenomenology, which, I mean, I don't know how much of intersubjectivity is used in Seminar 2, but there is this critique of Merleau-Ponty from his lecture that he gave on philosophy and psychoanalysis, the emphasis of perception and Gestalt, to where it's like, well, he's just like, he doesn't understand the symbolic aspect and the structuration of it.
Right. Like, I think he was always proximate to Sartre. And I think you're right to pick up on that. Like, I think there's a tremendous anxiety of influence. I think his own theory of the gaze, despite Sartre's influence, but I mean, he even calls phenomenologies in the subtitle of being a nothingness, right? Like, so he's clearly a phenomenological thinker, and yet his conception of the gaze is pretty close to Lacan's, because it's about the leaves rustling behind the person who's looking. And so that's, there's a little bit of, I think you can see the way in which that fits in with Lacan, like the little sardine can bubbling in the, like there's a kind of, there's a parallel, I think, between those two. But the Merleau-Ponty thing, I think, the problem is, just like you said, that Merleau-Ponty thinks his great book is Phenomenology of Perception, right? And so it's never about locating. And then there's this real divide in Merleau-Ponty between his political essays and his phenomenological essays, which are all focused on how we perceive things. And you're like, wait a minute, like, doesn't the political shape the where we're positioned to make our perceptual apprehensions? But he doesn't think about it that way. So I think that the divide is almost between Merleau-Ponty and Lacan. It's you can't bridge it. But I think what's interesting about Sartre is there is a move in being a nothingness in the direction of politics, and the like for Sartre, intersubjectivity is not, that it much more opens. He doesn't. I mean, the failure is this in a certain way the same. Like, he doesn't conceive of a third party that's always there, right? But there still is the way that he grasps subjectivity is such that he's really focused on how the other is impacting the subject. Whereas I think for Merleau-Ponty, the other is only within the field of perception, right? Like the other isn't behind the subject. So once Sartre can think of the other as behind, then you're already kind of on Lacan's turf about the symbolic or even the real, right? Like, so that's why I think there's a certain proximity to the one and not to the other. Even in Seminar 11, remember, he has this thing where he's like, I think it's Miller says, you want to revise what you said about your essay on or your discussion of Merleau-Ponty and the visible and invisible. He's like, no, not a word. I still have my same critique. So, and I think that's why, because he's like, it's all about the figure, right? And like the perception, and not about what the position from which we're looking to make the perception. And that's what Lacan cares about.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting with the kind of elaborating on the fact that Merleau-Ponty only sees the other in the field of perception. And this is why, like, it seems like if I'm not mistaken, in Visible and the Invisible, he kind of takes on like this approach of like solipsism as like a starting point. It kind of seems like, whereas like there is a critique of that in being a nothingness. And the famous line in Start the Hell is Other People. It's the fact it's like, your image of yourself is trapped in the other's perception of you, the other's image of you, and how they view you.
Right. And I think the whole, like the problem of being for others is such a huge problem in that book, right? Like it's a huge problem. So I think there's much more of a sense of that in Sartre than in Merleau-Ponty, which is why I think Lacan is more proximate to him, even though if you took up the total mentions, Merleau-Ponty probably gets more mentions in Lacan's whole career than Sartre does.
Yeah, that's true. And it's weird because, like, if you look at the way subjectivity is for Sartre, it's like the self-relating negativity, right? And it has the split, right?
I know. I mean, look, my claim would be, if you add the unconscious to Sartre, you get Lacan.
Exactly.
That's what I'm firmly convinced of that. Like, I don't think there's really that much difference between them, other than, I mean, you could say there's a huge difference, that other than Sartre has no conception of the unconscious at all, right? Like it's like the exclusion of that is constitutive of his whole project.
So one of the concepts that I felt I really struggled with was trying to understand exactly how Lacan connects the Sartrean notion of the gaze to perversity, and intersubjectivity is still at play at this point, but he's also contrasting balance concept of primary love with polymorphous perversity. And if I understood it correctly, Lacan's trying to explain how polymorphous perversity already, in some sense, leaves room for an other. It isn't this purely autoerotic narcissism, but in the repetition of it, it opens up a space for, well, among other things, I think the superego and the law. But his attempt to try to think all of these concepts together and like keep all of these plates spinning, I found like really dizzying and difficult.
It's really hard. I think I agree totally. I think he's got like superego, intersubjective, like you're right. Like, and I think I mean, if I'm not mistaken, like the seminar almost begins with superego, right? Like it has an important role even from a couple mentions, right, in relation to the law, and then like there's this whole discussion of the law. But I think one of the things he's doing, and I find this incredibly important, and for a long time it wasn't really understood in the reception of Lacan, at least in the outside of France, is that he's trying to say that the symbol, he even says this, some like straight almost this, that the symbol is there from the beginning, right? Like he wants to not allow us to think that first there's this imaginary plenitude, and then the symbolic comes in and cuts it off and subjects the being to castration, etc. No, like first there's the symbolic ordering, and out of that emerges the imaginary illusion of plenitude, right? So it's so in a certain sense, symbolic castration is for Lacan an enabling first step, not something that comes on to cut off that initial plenitude. So I think that's one way to understand this idea of polymorphous perversity, right? Like he's not rejecting that idea, but he's saying it's already, like, it's only through symbolic castration that polymorphous perversity can even be possible in the first place, right? Like there's no initial non-castrated plenitude that then, like, and I think, there's a certain reading of Freud that says there's the plenitude of the mother's breast. This is object relations, right? Like there's a plenitude of the mother's breast. And then there's the Oedipal father, the father comes in and says no, and then you have to experience lack, right? That's not Lacan's position. Like Lacan's position is first there's symbolic lack, right? Like first you're situated symbolically, and then you get this illusion of plenitude that comes after. So that's why for him, it's important that the mirror stage comes after, it's not the first thing, right? Like plenitude is this illusion that comes after lack, not it's a response to lack. It's made possible by lack. It's not something that gets cut off by lack. So I think that's really, really important. And that's the part of what he's trying to do in these seminars, these first two, is to say, wait a minute, no, first is the symbolic situatedness, first is lack, then is the illusion of plenitude.
Right.
That's really interesting, because I was actually about to ask the question in regards to the mirror stage, and you kind of already elaborated on it. But it's the fact it's like Heidegger. It's like we're already thrown into being in the world with others. We're already thrown into language, and he makes a distinction in Seminar One, the difference between language and speech. It's that, like, with, for instance, bringing up Melanie Klein and Little Dick, that he's like, the kid's not an idiot with language. In fact, he might be even a master at it, but he just doesn't know how to properly speak and have speech at his disposal. Therefore, he's not thrown into like the whole Oedipal triangle, for lack of a better term. So it seems like with what you're saying, that there's a structural lack, that the mirror stage, not only in the development of maybe like a neurotic or like the Oedipus complex, it's definitely not developmental. However, there's like, maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, this troglodyte of always like retroactively trying to ground yourself in a reconnaissance. And it even seems like it takes place in the moment that the transference occurs, that there's, through this working through, there's always instances of trying to situate yourself, but it's always in relationship to your analyst, it seems like. Even
that's
though
right. That's right.
To not, make your analyst a little other, but to understand, the discourse of the other in the unconscious.
Right. And that's interesting that you brought that up, Andrew, because it's a question whether this is a break in Lacan's thinking, right? Like it's a terminological break for sure, but so at this point the analyst is the big other, right? And then by Seminar 11, the analyst is going to be the objet a, right? So I think I would say this is not just a terminological break, but a real break, because I think part of it is his idea of what the cure is in these first two seminars is you have a symbolic circuit, there's an imaginary detour that cuts off that circuit, and we have to restore the symbolic circuit. And that's what the analyst does by occupying the position of the third party, the big other, right? So it's, and so there's not really the space for the real and the disruptiveness of the real in that conception of analysis. I don't think. I mean, maybe there could be an argument about it, but I think that, so I think you're right to say that the part of what the analyst is doing is forcing the subject to recognize that what you're looking at it imaginarily, but you need to look at it, experience it symbolically, right? Like, don't be deceived. And that's why he has that great line to Serge Leclerc, I think. He goes, "You little idolaters," right? Like there's this sense of like overinvestment in the image by not just the people attending his thing, but by everybody, you know, in the 50s, right? Like that, like in 20th century Europe, like, or 20th century the world, right? Like the sense that the image, we look for the image as our truth. And I think he wants to say, no, actually, I mean, I always think you could really reduce what he's doing here down to this. Like, we think we're invested in what we see, but he wants us to get to think about where we see from, right? Like what is the symbolic coordinate from which you see? And I think that's why so many Marxists were so taken by him as a thinker, right? Because what is it to be a bourgeois is to just think, oh, what I see is what there is, and not, oh, wait, you're seeing from a certain position. And that's what really counts, right?
Yeah,
so
and
I think
it's
yeah.
Oh, just the fact that you brought up like the position that you're seeing yourself, because he's like always alluding, like, remember, we're not an abstract I. We're not just the I, like the scientist.
Right. I mean, the critique of science is pretty is significant here, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Because he also, at another point, not in this seminar, but he says the subject of psychoanalysis is the subject of science.
Right.
But seemingly would contradict that, but I think it actually dovetails.
I think it supports it, Nick. Yeah. So that's in seminar 11. And I think what he means by that is psychoanalysis is only possible during the epoch of modern science. Because why? Because science depends upon the repression of the subject, right? Like let's say I do some kind of stupid scientific experiment to prove that, I don't know, photons travel faster than the speed of light. I know they don't, but whatever. Okay. And then, but in order for that experiment to really count, you have to be able to do it. And it can't matter that, and you can't say like, oh, it's Todd McGowan's theory that it doesn't matter, right? Like and so that's why the repression of subjectivity is not just incidental to science, it's actually crucial to scientific insights. But that repressed subject returns. And that's the idea that psychoanalysis it only emerges through the scientific repression of the subject as this thing that returns, right? So,
yes.
So I think he is, so in that sense, like it's a critique of scientific objectivity, but on the other hand, he's saying that scientific objectivity is exactly what allows psychoanalysis to emerge so he's not saying, you know, you hear this all the time, like, oh no, we need to think about the subjectivity of who's doing the experiment. And like, there's a whole critique of science, like a humanistic critique of science happening all the time right now, right? Like, we need to not just have, I don't know, a bunch of white guys doing the experiments. We need to have but the whole point of science is it can't matter who does the experiment. And if you allow it to matter, then you're not doing modern science, right? So it's interesting that Lacan agrees with that, but then he says, okay, but something is repressed there. That's what psychoanalysis attends to.
It almost seems like very like parallel to Hegel and sense certainty and like the observing nature aspect of understanding like the failures of like,
right. No, that is it. Yes, Andrew, that's exactly it. It's observing reason, I think, right? Like
or observing reason. Yeah.
It's the first section of the reason section of phenomenology, right? Like that's precisely, but what's great about Hegel, isn't it, that he says, in order to take up, like, observing reason doesn't appear in the beginning. It appears after we've already understood that subjectivity is the whole world that it sees. So, I mean, you could have, like, no modern scientist would like to be located at that position in the phenomenology, because he's saying you can only see the world as reasonable because the world is yourself, really, right? Like, so it's, so there's a way in which Hegel is, I think you're right to see the connection between those two things, but I don't think Hegel sees he would admit that it's repressed, if he wouldn't use this term, but repressed by the scientist. But he would say it actually has to be there for the science to work. Because if the world was totally foreign to us, we couldn't even make calculations about it, right? Like, even our very ability to make the calculations about the world suggests that we're out there in it. And that's what reason does. It sees itself in the world. It's a great connection, though. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the one thing that like has helped me understand like a little bit more Hegel is a buddy of mine who's really into Hegel, and I see the connections with Lacan. It's like what you always say. It's like when he's referencing Hegel, he's the least Hegelian, but then when he's not, he's his most.
It's absolutely true.
True with a lot of the French thinkers. And I think really the aspect of repression that's kind of like really I've been really trying to think about is the notion of overdetermination, because it seems like the repression of the subject in science comes back in this overdetermined form in various sub-disciplines. But the point is, like in psychoanalysis,
what are you thinking of specifically?
Like the notion of like, well, for me, it wasn't really science in particular, although when he brought that up, it kind of seems like the case, but more in the fact of like playing with overdetermination, because I know Althusser uses that a lot, but and how like, you know, in certain I was talking to this with Nick, but like in like when you go from like feudalism to capitalism, it's like nothing was really resolved, rather it was like repressed in this overdetermination of like, you know, the you know, the CEO and like the workers that are just become a new you know, semblance of you know, the king and the serf, right, the landlord and the serfs, and other things like, you know, transitioning, like racism and slavery never ended. Like racism comes back in a new overdetermined form and takes place in like police brutality and other things.
Or Jim, exactly.
Yeah. And then you're continuously seeing this in the rise of like capitalism. It's something I'm playing with, like the notion of like overdetermination and then even like semblance. And the fact is like with the media being in the medium, social media depends upon the image. So it's like this image kind of not only creates like a overdetermined condensation, but even a displacement of the structural mechanisms. And again, this might also be like a homology with Zizek about like the notion of the dream and the commodity as well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. It also, don't you think it really, like this total immersion to the image in social media, like it again blinds us to the symbolic structure that's mediating all those images, right? So I mean, I think in a way, these first two seminars are even more important. The more that people are like stuck within the image, because the image seems to be true. I mean, that's the thing about it, right? Like it seems like it's giving us the truth, but we don't see from where we're getting the truth, right? Like even in like seemingly emancipatory images, right? Like the image of George Floyd being killed, like that seems like like the dissemination of that is an emancipatory, like, oh, you know, helps to spur on the Black Lives Matter movement, blah blah blah. But isn't it still like we don't see the position from which we're seeing, which is the larger structure, like and so we don't, what do we not see? Like, okay, we see police violence and maybe even as a structure, but we don't see the way in which that racist police violence is part of a whole structure of discriminatory housing, right? Like that, which is like, that's why the police violence, it's not because we don't have violent racist police officers because police officers are bad. No, because certain neighborhoods they're trying to protect, right, from a certain kind of people from entering. So, but that structure is not visible within the image of even this, you know, disseminating this in an emancipatory way, I think. So I think that's why it seems to me like what Lacan is saying here is so important, because if you can see the position from which you see, then that opens up a whole kind of political aspect that otherwise would be invisible.
I'm gonna go out on a limb here and like ask if you think that you could connect this argument to even the presence of like an hallucination, and it's like the hallucination that Lacan explores in Seminar 1 is the one that the Wolfman has, right, where he sees the nail through his hand. It's there, and then it's gone, and then that becomes a reference point for this concept of Verneinung, which equally explores in all of its Hegelian valences. And he's somewhat ambivalent about it. He's reading, is it On Narcissism where that's described, the Freud essay? I believe that's the one.
I think the essay is just Verneinung. I think it's an essay called Negation.
It's just for, it's just Verneinung.
It's just Verneinung, yeah.
But I thought that was a baffling concept, but one of the more fascinating points in the seminar, because it's like,
I agree. I agree. Like,
but different. That is not. I don't know who that woman was, but it was not my mother. Right? There's so much there. It's a short essay, but there's so much to unpack there that I don't know. I'm just kind of spitballing right now, but when I thought of the image, I think of something hallucinatory in that vein.
It seems like there is that overdetermination, right? Especially like in a Du Lacan, when the girl hallucinates about the rat right there in the waiting room. It's like almost like a depiction of the same kind of form.
Right. And it's such an excellent example, right? Like, I think it's one of those points where Hegel and psychoanalysis come together as well, right? Like it's through the negation that we arrive at the insight of the truth, right? Like, this is like Freud starts the essay with, this is not my, when the patient says, this is not my mother, that's my, so I'm like, okay, this is definitely your mother. And then he gets to this idea that the finding of an object is always the refinding of it. And that idea, like, in a certain way, I think the importance of that essay really for Lacan can't be overstated. It's just a little 4-page essay, but it's so important because that's really how Lacan conceives symbolic order, right? Like symbolic order, there's no initial object. There's just the refinding of the object through the symbol, but it's an object that one never had in the first place. So I think, and again, I think this is the question of overdetermination, right? Because there's no initial thing. There's just the different ways in which we try to come back to the thing that we never had in the first place, right? So it's like capitalism does this all the time, right? Like, there's some initial relation that's missing, and then there's all these rewritings of it that aren't there's not really a first thing there, right? And so I think that's what, for Lacan, again, it's this priority of the symbol over the imaginary or social reality, right? Like the Verneinung, the negation, is about the priority of the symbol, because that's what the symbol does. He even says famously, symbol is the murder of the thing, right? Like that's the okay, it murders the thing, but that's how the thing emerges. So it's that Nachträglich retroactive movement that creates the thing that's then been lost or murdered.
And for overdetermination to even be possible, right, it's from the failures of repression, right? Because there's never 100% repression. So that's why all repression is a return of the repressed, correct?
Right. Exactly. And then he also says, where does repressed return from? It returns from the future, right? Like which gets to this idea of the priority of the symbol, right? Like, it comes, like, first we have the return of the repressed, and then we look. It's like the famous thing from the Project for Scientific Psychology, this patient Emma who goes into a store, right? And she has, this is Freud's own example of Nachträglichkeit or retroactivity, right? She goes into a store and she sees two clerks laughing and she runs out of the store. She's traumatized, right? And Freud's like, well, that can't be, two people laughing isn't a trauma. But then through analysis, they discover this prior relationship, which was a clerk sexually abused her while laughing, right? So then Freud's point is the later relation actually determines the traumatic valence of the earlier one, right? Like it only will have become a trauma. It's not so it's not like a trauma and then you get the repetition of it. It's through the repetition of it that it becomes, the initial event becomes a trauma in the first place. So I think that's why Lacan is so consumed with symbolic order here. And also this touches on the logical time problem as well, right? Because it's through the later event that the earlier one takes on its meaning.
It's almost like the trauma or the symbol that returns from the future is like John Connor from Terminator.
That's right. No, it's the right. It's like he read Lacan, like Cameron read Lacan or something. Right. Yeah.
Do you have anything, Nick?
No, nothing to add to that. I know we had a really good question from Mike.
Oh, Michael Downs. Yeah. So Michael Downs wanted me to ask this because I guess he forgot to ask you in the conversation, but he wants to know when it comes to the quilting point, in the act of quilting, it undermines, right, the master signifier in the process. But I think his question was, can in the process of quilting, the quilting point become the master signifier? And if so, why? But if not, why?
Well, I don't think it can become, but I don't think it necessarily undermines it. Like, let me give you my favorite example for the quilting point and the relation to master signifier is under Nazism, Germany or Aryanists or whatever functioned as the master signifier and Jew functioned as the quilting point. Well, that didn't undermine Aryanists. It supported it, but it couldn't then become a master signifier. So I think that the proper political quilting point does undermine, or I would put it this way, it reveals the stupidity of the master signifier, right? Because I think
that's what he meant by undermining, by the fact it reveals it.
Yeah, don't you think like one of the ways in which master signifiers are most oppressive is they hide their stupidity, right? They seem to be meaningful. Like it seems to mean something. Like it's like, think about how like I don't know,
like
make
Biden.
America great. MAGA. Yeah. Make America great again. It seems like America really, but if you say like, what is this America? He's like, like, what can he say? Like apple pie, mother. I mean, it's like stupid, right? Like you couldn't say what it is. He may give a couple examples, but so that I think it's only when you say there's a, what do they call what were those line of people coming up through Central America? What did they call it? It was at the midterm election last time. I forget. A caravan. There you go, Nick. Yeah. It's only when there's the caravan coming as this quilting point that then you know what it means to be American. Like, oh, we're the ones being invaded by the caravan, right? So So I think that the master signifier is inherently stupid, and then the more you can, the political quilting point, I would call, draws attention to that stupidity, whereas the conservative or apolitical quilting point makes it seem like it's meaningful, right? Like it makes it seem like it has a meaning. But I think that it's interesting that Lacan totally drops he develops it in the next seminar. We're going to talk about seminar 3, and then just totally lets it go. But it is interesting how even in these first 2 seminars, he doesn't yet have the structural, like there's no notion really of, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, of name of the father, master signifier. There's none of that, right? So
it's just the symbol.
It's really a kind of immature, I mean, I like these seminars, but conception of the symbolic order. I mean, the only thing that there's the great analysis of the Poe story, of Purloined Letter, I think, in seminar 2, which is really crucial. But it seems like most of his energy in these first 2 seminars, this is true about the Écrit as well, is about combating the emphasis on the ego and saying, look, think about this third party, but not about developing what the symbolic structure actually looks like.
I think though, like he does like try to like elaborate as much as he can, and we've been joking about this for the past 2 days about the importance of the signifier of the elephant. It's like, thank goodness we have the name the elephant. They don't have to be here for us to speak about it for animal rights and stuff like that. We could just do whatever we want. in the name of the elephant because we have it regardless of their absence in the room. Like
right,
so
right. And I like this idea a lot too, that what we do with that name elephant means
yeah.
more than what we do with means more for actual elephants than what we do with actual elephants, which is of course true, right? Like that like the relative annihilation of elephants is because the way we dealt with that signifier. So I think it's a really good point. I think, I mean, it is funny. I guess have you heard this, that, or maybe he writes, I can't remember if this is written in the seminar or not, but supposedly he passed out like elephant pictures.
Yeah, toy elephants. It's like when I made a meme about it. They're like a dude crying. And it's like when you leave seminar 1 and the only thing you got about from it was a toy elephant and nothing else in psychoanalysis.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. I went to Lacan and all I got was the stupid elephant.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, apropos of what you're saying about the quilting point, do you think then it's like the quilting point needs to be kept at a proper sort of proximity from the subject of the master signifier in order to operate? Because if it's like the quilting point is the place where everything comes together and makes sense, but only from a certain distance and perspective, I'm imagining, because with the metaphor that he's using, the point de capitan, it's like that if you pick at that, it can come loose in a sense. It always risks coming loose, becoming threadbare in some sense. And I would imagine that structures of power are really predicated on, maintaining this correct.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Nick, I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're convincing me that maybe one of the things, because so quilting point, Lacan kind of, he totally drops it. I'm not totally, almost totally drops it. But the one way that it persists is in this notion of the short session, right? And so he punctuates the analysis by ending it at a certain point, right? Like, and that's, he doesn't say this, but that's his way of quilting the analysis. So I think you're probably right that, and by definition, that's temporary, right? Like it just, you quilt it once and then it's, there's another analysis. You have to quilt it a different way the next time, or else, I mean, if you quilted it the same way every time, that's his beef with the standard session, right? Like his beef with the standard session is, no, the problem is it just quilts it out the same way every time. And so it creates a consistent power structure, right? So in which nothing, the real can't break through, like there can be no disruptiveness. So I think you're probably right that anytime that quilting point becomes frozen or congealed, then that's the conservative gesture, right? Like that's the gesture that allows you to kind of feel like, okay, I know the terrain here. It's okay. Nothing disruptive is going to happen. It's, like like I know where the Jews are. I know I'm a German. Everything's okay. But I think that if you think of the quilting point as this intervention, then you always have to re-intervene. Otherwise it doesn't, it becomes that. And that maybe touches on, Andrew, what Michael's question was. Like, if the quilting point becomes too frozen, then I think it does end up feeding the significance of the master signifier rather than exposing its lack of a signified.
Do you think, with that being the case, that the quilting point remains frozen in like the way that he's criticizing analysis before then contributes to the conditions for like countertransference being possible, resorting to the atlas? Because I know we mentioned earlier and I kind of like forgot about it when we were talking about like how he's like kind of like making fun of them for being like idolaters, like being in that strict image of things. It's like you're always located on the plane of affects, and that's why he's always talking about, and later on in the transference, because another thing, it's like we don't really get like a whole like articulation of the symbolic order like in the way it structures, but we do get like the notion of like the importance of the exchange of the symbol, and rather it's that what's being transferred in speech, not affects and emotions,
which is why Exactly, Andrew, which is why when he talks about Dupin and the purloined letter, he makes such a big deal out of the exchange of money, right? Which allows the analyst and the analysand not to have this emotional connection, right? Like that. So I think, I mean, he spends a lot of time saying, I think you're so right to link the imaginary to the affect, because I think he does link them in that way. And I think he spends a lot of time trying to say, no, it's not like analysis isn't about the affect. And if you're right that if you get in this game of affects, then you're involved in the countertransference, even though ultimately he's going to reject that. He ultimately will say there is only transference. There is no such thing as the countertransference. But I think what he means is you get caught up in the transference. What he would say is once you get in the affect game, you're caught up in the transference, and you're lost the position of the analyst.
Yeah, most definitely. And there's also something too that he mentions with like referencing the De Magistro about like the importance of like how the signifier plays a role in naming things, because he says that all words or right signs or all words are ultimately nouns, like even like conjunctions like if,
Right. Right.
It becomes like, I don't like the word if becomes a noun. And that in this relationship, which kind of is very analogous to what he'll talk about in seminar 2 with the Meno. But when we're talking about speech, it's like if you have something to teach in this position of like the teacher and the student, but it's like in the way of questioning, you're bringing out something from the student, that they're remembering, rather than
right. Which is why he says, I loved this point, although I don't think he's right, because I've been a professor who didn't have anything to say, but he says, once you're in the structural position of professor, you always have something to say, right? Like he's like, and again, it's about this whole symbolic position relative to the like you're whatever you are as flesh and blood or as an imaginary being, right? Like once you're in this structural position, you have something to say. Although I haven't found that to be true. I've been in front of the class and been in a panic because I'm like, wait a minute, I got 30 minutes left. I have nothing left to say. So I think it's not true, but I think it's a nice point anyway.
More general question for you, Todd. Like,
yeah,
what do you think the effect reading these earlier seminars should have on, let's say, a Lacanian who is very hung up on the later seminars and believes that that's really the meat of everything he has to say? Why read seminar 1 or 2?
Yeah, I mean, I think for 2 reasons. I think one, I always found it in. I think there's probably no better way. I always think of seminar 2 as the symbolic order seminar, right? Like I think he does. We've talked about how he doesn't really lay out the structure like name of the father, quilting, but that said, I think he really he talks about what the effect of the symbolic order is in these early seminars in a way that he won't later. And I also think he really gets at how the imaginary symbolic relation functions. And then once he turns to the real, the imaginary basically drops out. Like he doesn't really care about it in the later, like from seminar 9, even 8 onward, the imaginary is basically not. I mean, it sort of returns with the Borromean knots at the very end, but I don't think it's as crucial. So for me, that's a real, like, to understand that relationship, you almost have to go to these seminars. So that's one thing. But I also think that is there anywhere else where and this is related, where he really gets at the structuring power of the symbolic, right? Like just how it puts you in a certain position, and you might think different things, but you're in a certain position. So and it's very Levi-Straussian, right? Like whatever you individually think or want, or who cares, because you're in a certain structural position. Like that's the great thing about Purloined Letter and his reading of it. Like you're blinded. If you're in the position of the police, you're just blinded, right? Like you don't, it's not because you're a stupid cop, it's because you're in the structural position of the police. And so I just think like, I don't know, like I'm a professor. A lot of times I think like, oh, I'm not like the other professors and I'll like try to be funny and cool to the students. But I'm in a certain structural position and I need to be reminded of that quite a bit. And so I think these early seminars do a good job of getting at that. And that I would almost say that completely disappears in the seminars that are the ones that I like. For me, it's basically from 9 to 16 is the real part of the matter. But I think that idea, what I just said, it's gone by then. So I do think that I have to say, I see a real +2 is just one is I think more about analysts. And so I think it can be hard for someone who doesn't want to be an analyst to get into a lot of the questions. But I think seminar 2, it's just really, it really gets at that issue in such a crucial way. I've taught it several times and students seem to like it almost better than any other seminar because it does that. So that's what I would say.
What are the crucial distinctions between the purloined letter and the decree versus the one that's given in seminar 2?
Oh my God. Yeah, Andrew, it's a great question because it's just proof that he was just an ass, right? Because no one would do this. No one would write a clearer account or give a clearer account in the oral thing to your little group of, it was like 25 people, right?
Yeah.
50 people, who knows? It wasn't the big crowd that for seminar 11. So who would make that clearer than the one to the public in the written form? It just doesn't, it's just so it's perverse, I think.
Yeah.
But I think the couple things, like I think he really emphasizes the different the structural positions that each figure occupies in a way that he doesn't later. And then he also, I think, gives a lot more, it's just a fuller account of things. I'm not sure, I'm not sure that anything is missing in the Écrit. It's just that it's just not fleshed out in the way.
It's so difficult to read.
I know. And then you read it in the seminar, you're like, it's fine. It's not hard at all, right? But in the Écrit, it's just like mystifying. And I can't tell you how much I hate that. I hate it. I mean, I have the immense respect for Lacan as a thinker, but I find this kind of like perverse game of his writing, I just find it unacceptable.
It's very perverse.
Yeah. That's all you can say. It's just perverse. Yeah.
How should we go about reading the Écrit without wanting to, take a cyanide pill?
No, I would throw it away.
Throw it away.
I don't think it's worth reading. No.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think it's only worth reading for people once you've read every seminar a couple times. Then you read it and it's not hard because he's just going over, but it's only after you've completely mastered the seminars that you even, this is my view, that you even open the Écrit, right? Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I have to say, I've read it through, I don't know, a couple times, but I never go back to it. Mm-hmm. Occasionally people ask me, like somebody asked me to do a thing on the subversion of the subject Écrit. And so I went back and went through it and wrote something up. Okay. So I did it then, but basically I never consult that. I never consulted. So this is not necessary. This may be a minority report because people have been very critical. Like I talked to Jean-Claude Milner and he's like, he just thinks the Écrit give everything of Lacan and the seminar just, okay. I like Milner. I don't agree with him on that. So, and you're like Gabriel Tupanamba, basically same position. So there are people, I don't think mine's a minority report on this issue, but because Slavoj completely agrees with me. So completely, he's like the Écrit just never, he just doesn't care. So, and that's my absolute view. Mm-hmm. Useless.
Yeah.
Useless. Yeah.
Besides like function and field, but even then it's like he's already
even that, right. It's interesting historically, but is there a single insight? The only one I maybe would say is the discussion of perversion in convex sod.
Yeah,
because I'm not sure that he talks about perversion so much in any of the seminars. So
Mhm.
that's one where that is actually one that I look at occasionally. But Danny Nobis wrote a great whole book on convex-odd that I think is a lot better than the seminar. So I would read that before I'd read the seminar.
Because Kant of Exod is like pretty essential reading for understanding Zizek, wouldn't you say? He's always referring.
I maybe, but the problem is, Nick, that he and Danny, there's this collection coming out. I'm not trying to pimp it. I co-edited. It's called something like Zizek Responds or something. And Danny attacks Slavoy's reading of Convex-odd. And I'm Slavoy's ally on everything, right? But on this, I think Danny's right. Like he just makes up his own reading of what Lacan is saying, and then just says Lacan is saying that. I happen to think that what Slavoy is saying is smarter and more interesting than what Lacan says. And I think Lacan is just basically recapitulating Horkheimer and Adorno's thing from Dialectic of Enlightenment, which I think he knew even. So, but Slavoy's point, of course, is interesting because his point is that it's Kant that's the truth, that Kant is really revealing this inner truth of Sod rather than vice versa. And so, well, that's much more interesting than this basic thing like, oh, look, the moralist is really just the same as the sadist. Okay, who cares?
It's funny if like Hegel's the sublime hysteric, then Kant's the pervert. Even though it's like for Kant, it's like he's the perfect neurotic subject. He puts limitations on what we know, right, epistemologically, but it's like in his ethics, he's perverse.
Right. Exactly. Anyway, but I think, I don't think convex-odd is important for understanding Slavoy, just because I think he misreads it so radically. And importantly, like I like his point, but I don't think it's a reading of that essay.
So how much of like, how should I word this?
How much of my life have I wasted reading Lacan?
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead. Ask your question.
For like, how much of Hegel would you see like in Lacan, like in far as like the dialectic or Hegel in general? Is it like all of like the phenomenology, or would you say it's more like from science of logic or what? Because I know
think
there's
it's
more Kojève stuff, like the Kojèvian.
Okay, I think it's a Kojèvian Hegel up to the point where he thinks he's breaking from Hegel. So up till seminar 8, and then in seminar from 9, so 8's a little transitional, but from 9 through 16, I think he's a complete Hegelian science of logic, not Kojèvian Hegel, except so basically, I don't know what to call this, like a dialectical psychoanalyst, something, like whatever the position we want to call what we do. But again, I think the limitation of Hegel, there's 2 limitations: that there's no conception of the unconscious, there just isn't, and there's no conception of death drive. He just doesn't he understands negativity and contradiction, but he doesn't understand the way in which we would get off on making trouble for ourselves, which is how I understand death drive. So, so he's still some idea of the good, I think, still handicaps Hegel in a way that it doesn't Lacan. So I think that's what I would say. Like, I think from seminar 9 to 16, Lacan is perfectly Hegelian and even beyond Hegel, because he has these 2 ideas that Hegel doesn't. But ultimately, I think Hegel's a more interesting thinker than Lacan. It's my view.
Yeah, and the more that like I read Lacan, the more I'm like, okay, I need to read more Hegel, and then I'm like seeing kind of like a parallel. But as you mentioned, the 2 distinctions is like no death drive, no unconscious. Because the one thing about the unconscious is that it, the one, it knows no time, right? And then like, because there's repression, there's the overdetermination aspect, which is like a multiplicity of different causes that allow for a repetition.
Right.
But there's always like repetition of like certain contradictions in Hegel historically, right? But it's not like like the way in the unconscious of drive, right?
Yeah, Andrew, it's a great point, actually. I mean, I've often wrestled with this very question, right? Because it is true that, like the famous line about Napoleon had to be defeated twice, Caesar had to be defeated twice. Okay, that's not exactly what psychoanalysis thinks by death drive and repetition, right? Or the way overdetermination has to work, right? Like it's still, there's still and I think the one way to maybe rescue it is to think of Hegel, and I think this is right, as a thinker of retroactivity, and then maybe that this conception of repetition, like everything gets repeated just on a different level, right? Like, so you go through the logic and you could, like, the dialectic that he begins with, even of being nothing and becoming, like that even just repeats, right? So maybe that's right. Like maybe there is a sense of death drive if you think of it all as this in terms of retroactivity. But unconscious, I don't think that you could, because it's not the same to say that we're on a, like Hegel's drawing our attention to thought that we have but aren't aware of it. That's not the same thing as the unconscious, right? Like for Freud, the unconscious is this other scene, and it follows a logic. What? Sorry.
It was like a forgetful forgetting, right? That's what repression is. Yeah.
Right. Which is different than just something. It's like something that we haven't. Like it's not the same as, like there is a way in which Hegel fits in what Lacan is saying in these seminars. Like he's bringing up the symbolic structure through which but that's not unconscious in Freud's sense or Lacan's sense. Yeah.
Got it. You got anything, Nick?
I just want to know what else I don't have to read. I get like a bibliography of things I can just skip.
Things you can skip. So I don't know. Acre is a pretty big one to skip. So that I feel good about that. I think here's where I would go. Here's what I would say about the seminars. So I think, as I've said, I think like 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 are really, really crucial. I find this is a minority report, but I find the discourse seminar, so 17, I don't think there's much in there. And I think actually the later Lacan, I find not that interesting. I find even seminars 4, 5, and 6, not that compelling. 7 is just, it has to be read because it's it doesn't fit in. And so it has all this stuff that either it's the key to everything or it doesn't fit at all and is worthless. Yeah. So it's a kind of a interesting thing. But to me, that's like, I think, and 3 is really important, I think. So the psychosis seminar, really important. But then 4, 5, and 6, I think are a little bit of a letdown. And there's 7, which is, I think, this either incredible breakthrough or one-off. And then I think there's this movement in anxiety and seminar 11, and then seminar 13 is does this incredible reading of Foucault. It's a response to Foucault's reading of Las Meninas, the Velázquez painting, and it's so nicely lays out the difference between historicism and psychoanalysis. So I think that, to me, it's incredibly valuable for that. And then the Pascal's Wager seminar, where he develops the notion of surplus enjoyment, which is seminar 16. So those would be, to me, the highlights. So 1, 2, like 2 and 3, 7, 10, 11, 13, 16. And then to me, the rest is okay. If you have time, if you have world enough, like what is that, Andrew Marvell? If I had world enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime, right? Like that. Okay. Yeah. So if you have world enough in time, you can do those other ones, but I don't think, like, seminar 6 has a long discussion of Hamlet. I don't think you're going to learn much about Hamlet. And I think if you already understand Lacan's theory of the signifier, I don't know that you're going to get, it's a long seminar. I'm not know that you're going to get that much out of it. So that would be those are my skips.
But according to the podcast that you had on the white theory, it's like it displays like a modern logic of the Oedipal complex, correct? Like Hamlet
does, right? Yeah, right. Which is why I find it less interesting, because I sort of, to me, Oedipal, not that invested in Oedipal complex.
Mhm.
As an
But it's
idea.
kind of like what you're saying. It's like, you know, if you read, is it 23 that's on Santham? It's like you're not going to get a great reading of Joyce, right? It's just Lacan.
That's right. That's right. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Right. If you go to Seminar 23 to understand Joyce, you're going to be really disappointed. And same thing with the Hamlet, discussion.
Funny story about that. It's via Joyce that I got into Lacan in the first place, and how I got into Slavoy's work, because I wanted to find out what his opinions on Joyce were. Couldn't find much. He hasn't really written on Joyce, not nearly as much as Kafka. And then I saw Slavoj speak when I was doing assistantship in Rome, and someone in the audience asked him who his favorite authors were, and he very categorically dismissed Joyce as completely overrated. So I got my answer years later.
That's great. Hey, do you know this friend of mine, Frances Restuccia? Because she's written a book on, I don't know what it's called. It's like Lacan and Joyce, but that's not it. It's something like that. So
I don't.
It's pretty good.
Yeah,
it's pretty good on it's on Santom Seminar and
Nice.
and Joyce. So
like there are people that think that, like, you know, you shouldn't read Lacan because, like, one, like, you know, the Chomsky defense is that he's just a charlatan, he has nothing to say. But that, like, you know, it's like I think we just discussed this even in like the first time we talked, was that, you know, he's just a meta commentary on Freud, but not just bringing in desire, because we already know that desire is like kind of like elaborated notion that he has, but like he's got more like at least revolutionary concepts of his own that makes it, you know, what Lacan is. Like, for instance, Santhome and, like, you know, the notion of like objet and fantasy, like, are crucial to
right. I mean, is there anybody before him, like just objet, who says, wait a minute, our desire isn't for the other's recognition, it's actually for this, what the other doesn't possess, right? Like this like piece of the other that the other doesn't have, like, and that if we got it, we miss it, right? Like that's just totally, I think it's totally right. And nobody said that before. So that seems to me to be, that alone is worth studying him.
Well, I got into Lacan, like, not from like Zizek, although Zizek, when I started reading him, he was obviously elaborating to Lacan. I'm like, who the hell is this Lacan guy? But it was really reading Anti-Oedipus that, like, I was like, okay, I need to read Lacan. So it was through reading Anti-Oedipus that I got into Lacan. I still have a hard time like deciphering, like, you know, the critique of psychoanalysis, but what they want to carry with schizoanalysis, and like the notions of, like, you know, the deterritorialization and the schizo break, and in psychoanalysis the notion of the death drive, because it's like, does the death drive really allow for some break to happen, you know, in their notions of understanding? I feel like maybe they didn't take death drive seriously, or even like keep it in mind. So it's just one of these questions that
I think that's right. I mean, it's interesting because it's in earlier Deleuze that he explores death and desire and repetition, right? Where he really, is that the name of it? I've forgotten the book.
Oh, Logic and Sense, right? Is where he
no, it's the one. What is it?
Difference
and repetition. Yeah.
He does.
I mean, that's really the exploration of death drive, and I think that it's funny because you're really right that when he writes with Guattari, he almost forgets about but you know, I have many of my friends that love difference and repetition, and they, because of the exploration of death drive, but my sense is he already has this productivist conception of desire, which doesn't allow him to really conceive of the radicality of death drive, even in that early book. And so I think you're right to put your finger on that as a limitation.
That too, and there's one thing that I've been discussing. I was discussing with Dave yesterday, with Nick, but like their notion of sexuality as well is like, they do want to defend libido as sexuality, compared to like, someone like Jung, right? Jung is like
Right.
version and psychic investment. They want to, take it up with somebody like Wilhelm Reich, because they're very much like into Reich.
Yeah.
And it still has this weird productive pantheistic aspect to it. But one thing is like, there's no aspect of sublimation, but assemblage and different ways that it becomes productive. And it doesn't, I feel like there's really no addressing to the aspect of there is no sexual relationship, which is obviously, Lacan in his later seminar, but it's radically being taken up by Supancic and then Chiesa and his The Not To, which I'm getting into right now. Definitely.
Right. Well, they couldn't have that because that's all about a failure. And for them, there's any negativity or failure is always false, right? Like that's their whole gambit. It's this Spinozist gambit that there's that there's only bad encounters, right? There's no internal, like nothing dies on its own. It only dies through a bad encounter. Whereas for someone like Hegel, the bad encounter only can happen because the thing is ready to die on its own. It's like totally different, opposed. I mean, Deleuze is right to think, he says somewhere, like, the only thinker I have nothing in common with is Hegel. I think he's right. I think that's right. And it's because it's precisely this thing, right? Like for Hegel, if we are beings that carry our own death within us, right? And if somebody else kills us, it's because we've already prepared the ground for this external death. Whereas for Deleuze, you never can be self-destructive.
Yeah.
Right.
It makes
it's funny
me
because he smoked, right? And I think I want to say, like, no, you're good at it. You're good at self-destruction.
Yeah.
No, what you're talking
about. He even killed
saying,
himself.
Like, yeah. But it made me think of what you're saying, like we already have like the death within us. It's like Hellraiser, you want to like open the box up, prepare for your death.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're also reminding me of what you were talking about earlier with the kind of retroactive illusion of plenitude. And I feel like I don't know my Deleuze all that well. I'm working through Anti-Oedipus right now, but it seems like in this, his sort of doctrine of like immanence does presuppose a kind of plenitude that would be associated with the imaginary, right? They're critical of Oedipus from the point of view that they think that it's a kind of overextended concept that is equal parts symbolic, equal parts imaginary, and that it's false in as much as it tries to have cover both ends simultaneously. But it seems like they are, through their critique, actually committing a similar sin in a sense.
I think that's right. I think there's no symbolic castration in the Deleuze and Guattarian world, right? I think there's just not. So it's a kind of
castration.
What? Right, exactly. Yeah. Like there's a kind of
right. They say like,
go ahead.
They say at one point, well, true feminists should say, I'm not castrated, very vehemently. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Pretty much reject the notion altogether.
Yeah. And I think that's, like they're trying to extend, they're trying to like break out of the family triad, which I applaud. I think that's right. But then they don't see how it's precisely within the social order that symbolic castration is functioning, right? It's not just castration is not just mommy, daddy, me. Castration is precisely entrance into the larger symbolic structure, right? So that's where I think that kind of misses that whole conception, that whole rejection of castration, because it's tied to mommy, daddy, me, misses what Lacan does to the idea of like extending it, like socializing castration, which I think is really, really, again, we were talking about his contributions, Andrew, like that seems to me to be one of the major ones, like this extending castration to the symbolic order, moving it away from just the threat of the father.
That's interesting thinking about that, because you mentioned about like how like in the early essays, he likes to play with like the animal man distinction. And it's the symbolic order that allows us to be different from the animal. And the fact that we maintain the lure of, our misrecognition of the body, where it's like, he says in the first seminar that what's the name of the lecture, Nick? You're always good at pronouncing the German term. Zeitlich.
You're gonna put me on the spot.
Zeitlich but
Entwicklungsgeschichte.
yeah, but there is the aspect of castration in us with the second alienation, but that the animal is always caught up in different lures that it can never go into this other symbolic arena or plethora that we have. And then in seminar 2, he says that the animal is a jammed machine, but we are like constantly in this machine, which is the symbolic order. And even though it breaks down, and this breakdown, there's this production that allows it to work again. I think that's kind of like, it seems like there is this like influence by D&G from this, or not like, now Lacan was influenced by D&G, but D&G were influenced by that.
I know, but don't you think it's interesting that for them, by the time of the Kafka book, it's like becoming animal is their response, that's their radical act, right? And so Lacan is absolutely opposite of that. Like he would never see becoming animal as some kind of freedom, because he would see it as that's how you trap yourself in the imaginary.
Yeah, and as you pointed out in your video essay, that the Gregor, as the bug is excess, not like becoming a minor, or like becoming animal in a positive way. It's the excess of capitalism.
Yeah.
One last thought that came to mind. The phallus. Your video essay on it was very illuminating for a number of us. And I think the one detail that stuck out to me that's not so obvious stuck out to me is the idea of the veil itself needing to be hidden in order for the absence of the phallus to be dissembled. Can you elaborate on that at all?
Yeah. So I in fact, let's think about it through the veil that everyone criticizes today, right? At least in the West, right? Like why is the wearing of the veil a problem, right? Because doesn't it expose the way in which we all have to wear the veil all the time, because that's what allows the phallus to operate, right? So that anyone who's actually, I'm not necessarily for women wearing the veil, right? I'm against, but the like vehement opposition that it inspires, especially in Europe, especially in France, seems to me to bespeak precisely this sense of like the veil exposes the fact that the veil is operative. And I also think the one of my favorite jokes from Slavoj is actually about this very question, where he says, someone stands up, there's a Soviet Congress taking place, and someone stands up and launches into this criticism of Comrade Stalin. And then someone else gets up and says, you idiot, don't you know you're not allowed to criticize Comrade Stalin? And then Slavoj always says, okay, the first person's definitely going to be shot, but the second person's going to be shot even earlier than the first person. And so what I like about that is what's happened, like the other person exposes the phallus, but the second person exposes the veil on the phallus, right? And so that's also this like prohibition on exposing the prohibition. And so I think it's interesting. Like I just did this thing in class where I asked my students, like, what's prohibited at the University of Vermont? And it's a hard, like they finally said you can't wear a MAGA hat, but I thought that's kind of cheap. It's like, it's a little too easy. And the whole point is the person who really said what was prohibited would have been maybe thrown out of the class, like not by me, but by the fellow students, right? Because they would have said like, well, you can't really say that you don't, I don't know, whatever. You don't believe in X, right? Like you can't. And so I think that's what it means, right? Like you can't, like this phallus that like orients our symbolic structure. If you expose the prohibition that keeps it in place, then that's what threatens. It's not just that the phallus has to remain veiled, It's that the veil itself has to be veiled. And if you expose the veil, then you're exposing the fact that all these people are invested in a lie. And that's what they refuse to, because the lie is, you like the German word, Verdrängung, right? Like it's primordially repressed. That's what's primordially repressed. Like that lie is primordially repressed, not the phallus itself. And so that's why the veil has to be veiled, right? And so once that gets exposed, then the community collapses, right? Like then it, and so that's why any kind of, so it's not just, and I think this is a little misleading, because it's not just the emperor has, the kid that says it's the emperor has no clothes. Oh, look, not exactly that. It's like, you need to believe, like he's saying to them, you need to believe that the emperor, or whatever. No one's allowed to say that the emperor has, like, that seems to me to be much more what the threat is, right?
So is this what not only but like Zizek elaborates in his Sublime or Perverse Guide to Ideology with the Batman, where like on the Dark Knight, pretty much how like everybody's saying that they're the Batman to conceal the fact that it's Bruce Wayne, the leader of Gotham corporations, that is the Batman, and everybody's taking on the onus of maintaining the lie, of maintaining the veil.
Right. So exactly, Andrew. Like the investment in the veil is the investment in the phallus, right? Like those are the same. Like no one is directly invested in the phallus; they're directly invested in the veil that covers over the phallus.
Because the fact is that the phallus is a hoax, but you got to maintain.
It's a hoax, right? It's a hoax. So anybody can. That's why everybody can say to themselves, like, "Oh, hoax." It's just, we don't really believe, like, we don't really believe in American way, or we don't really believe in the apple pie and mother and Thanksgiving and all that crap. But what they have to admit is this thing that covers, that veils that, right? Like that's what they can't have undermined.
That makes sense.
I think that's in any way connected with a disjuncture between the subject of the enunciation and the subject of the statement, or is that irrelevant here? What do you think?
No. It's exactly that, right? It's exactly that. Like we think, like it's precisely this subject of the statement that can, like, you can state, oh, I don't believe in the phallus, but on the level of the enunciation, you're invested in the cover for it, right? So that, it's exactly this. It's exactly that.
Yeah, because that was an idea that I struggled with for a while, but in relation to the phallus, it
makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Well, I don't have any more questions.
Yeah, there's a lot to absorb there. Covered a lot of ground. I want to thank you because your podcast helped me get through the pandemic. Discovering wide theory definitely made the experience easier. More.
Thanks, Nick. That means a lot to me. I really appreciate it.
So.
Yeah.
Thanks, I started getting more.
Great.
Yeah. I started getting more into
chatting
Lacan.
with
you. After like moved over here, I got more into Lacan, and I discovered your podcast. So, definitely helped getting into Seminar 1.
Well, thanks, Andrew. I appreciate it. Definitely. Yeah. And keep up the good work here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Todd.
All right. Take care, guys.
Bye.